There was a small farm located somewhere in southern Virginia where a farm owner named Emily lived, including with her uncle and aunt there. Their farm was located not far from Burkeville in Virginia, and Emily and her family had been raising horses for many years. Her parents lived in Kentucky, as they had their own farm. Emily loved it there, but then when she got older, she decided to move to Virginia to live with her aunt and uncle's farm. The farm where her aunt and uncle owned was a nice one, although Emily moved there so she could start a new farm country life there. Emily was 20 years old. She had graduated from college with a degree in vet tech, so she was able she was also to be a vet like her aunt was. The farm had a few horses inside the farm, 2 draft horses, 2 quarter horses, 3 thoroughbreds, along with 2 paint horses, just to name a couple of horses for Emily to ride when she was staying with her aunt and uncle. Emily worked on a farm work with her uncle, with the help of 2 draft horses that her uncle had owned. One of the paint horses just had a foal, to which it was a beautiful filly. The other paint horse, to which was a gelding, was sold the day the filly was born. Emily was arriving home from on that day the filly was born. She had been out of the country just to pack up her things from their college dorm room. She had graduated from college and had to travel back to her college to collect her things from her dorm room, which it took her one big trip to gather her things. When she arrived back at her aunt and uncle's farm, she pulled into the driveway in the front of the barn. Her uncle had seen his niece come out of the car, and he had to tell her the news that a filly was born at the farm. Emily loved to do English and Western riding. However, she did try to balance both styles of riding. Emily looked to see that her uncle was excited by the tell of his voice. This confused as it was the middle of April. "Emily! Emily!" her uncle shouted with excitement. "Uncle Paul, what is it with the excitement?" Emily asked, confused as to what was going on. He hadn't been this excited since the day he got a good set of horses arriving from the trailer. However, she figured that it was some good news. "Our paint horse mare Star had her foal while you were away. It's a filly, and you have to see her," Uncle Paul said in excitement as Emily headed with her uncle inside the barn, and then she followed her uncle towards the large stall at the end of the hallway. Passing by a few horses, there were 3 foals that were born in late March and early April. The foals were nearly a month old, and so far most of the foals were all colts. When Emily and her uncle headed for Star's stall, she saw the paint horse mare with her filly, who had just been born. The foal had a white face around its head, and the foal happened to be in Overo color. The filly looked at Emily, curious as she saw her approach her. Emily let her hand out for the foal to sniff, and that was when the filly smelt who Emily was, and Emily knew that this was the only filly to be born out of the horses of this year's foals. Emily saw her Aunt Amy, who was a vet, not far from the mother and foal, making sure that mom and baby were doing fine. "Aunt Emmy, this foal is cute. Can we keep her?" Emily asked. Now her aunt and uncle glared glances at each other. Every time they had foals being born at the farm, Emily would always ask if she could keep a foal to train herself. But her aunt and uncle always had sold the foals off to new homes, so they did that each time whenever they weaned the foals by September. "We'll think about it, Em," Paul said, as he and Amy were talking to each other. Emily continued to stare at the foal, hoping that she would get to keep the baby. She wanted to train and have it grow up with. "I'll name you Anastasia. I think it suits you," Emily said as she pets the foal. The foal seemed to like the name and started getting excited around the stall, only to head back to nurse from her mother. After a week since Anastasia was born, Emily had wished and prayed that every day Anastasia would be her horse. Emily had also had many ideas for the filly's future, and she would train her into Western and English riding, and even raise a foal to be a champion someday. The dreams she's always had with every foal went from her aunt and uncle's horses they had. However, with her busy college life all the time, it was hard to do so back then. But since she was out of college now, she would have more time to raise horses, ride them, and even raise them with her aunt and uncle's help. It was around breakfast time, and Emily was on the phone checking her Facebook. Then she would see her aunt and uncle looking at Emily. Could it be Anastasia could be Emily's horse? Emily didn't know, but she really did hope for some great news. Emily, your aunt and I have talked for a week, and we think you are ready to raise a foal yourself, Paul said. So, the filly that was just born a week ago is the foal I get to keep? Emily asked, as her aunt and uncle both nodded. You can keep the foal and raise her to be a riding horse. I see how well you do with the other horses we raise well here, Amy answered. So we think you can handle a foal. However, foals are a lot of work, so you would need to be responsible while raising the foal. I could do that. If I can handle a grown-up horse, I could sure handle a foal, Emily said with enthusiasm. That was always been something her aunt and uncle always loved to hear from their niece. Have you named the foal yet? Paul asked. Yes, her name is Anastasia. I will raise her well, and I will train her well when she gets older, Emily replied. That's my niece. Maybe for your birthday in June, your parents could come up and see her. But of course Amy, he suggested, did to Paul that it was a great idea. After breakfast, when Emily and her uncle turned out the mares with their foals, soon it was Star and Anastasia who came out to the back of the barn to fetch with. Once they got the mare and foal, they were put into a pasture with the free colts and their mothers. Emily would watch the horses every day in the pasture when she had nothing else to do, mainly to watch Anastasia in the pasture. While Anastasia was still a filly of the herd, the three other colts were roughhousing a lot, and when they would pick on Anastasia, to the filly she saw that the colts had picked on her just because she was the only filly in this year's foals. Anastasia would always remain either by herself or with her mother. Whenever she got the colts rough with Anastasia, her mother Star would get into the scuffle to end the fight and roughhousing. The free colts consists of 2 quarter horses and 1 paint horse, and they weren't really nice to Anastasia. At first, they would take time to get used to the filly. However, Anastasia always went towards the gates to see Emily, and when Emily was nearby, sometimes Star would come up to see Emily, but with her filly. But Anastasia was being independent and was more heads up to see Emily. The other foals didn't bother to come up, only because Anastasia was there and that they were busy playing, grazing, singing, or roughhousing with the others, sometimes with their moms. Emily would sometimes play with Anastasia in the pastures, as the young filly would play with the toys that the horses played with. Emily watched as the foal played with her toys. It made Emily smile to see that Anastasia was always excited, even happy to see her. The summer was hot on most days, but Emily never stopped playing and spending time with Anastasia. However, whenever she rode Star with Anastasia close by, she could watch Emily ride on her mother. Little did Anastasia know was that she was going to be trained under the saddle someday by Emily herself, but the filly didn't care. She was watchful of Emily. Emily's parents came to visit their daughter in June, and that they even got to see how beautiful Anastasia was, and say that one day she'll be a big horse like her mother. On summer days when it was too hot to ride, Emily would take Star and Anastasia to a stream not far from the barn. The stream was cool, and Emily always headed there whenever it was really hot outside. Anastasia and Star loved being near the stream during the summer, and they even got cool on some days when they got to the stream. It wasn't long until September had arrived. It was weaning time for all the foals that were born. The colts had a large foaling stall, while Anastasia had a stall all to herself. Since the colts were rough with Anastasia, it wasn't good to put them all in pastures at this point on. Emily had trained Anastasia some ground manners while the colts were in their pastures, and since she was halter broke, Emily was training her on a lunge line, along with some ground manners. Emily thought that training a full ground manners and lunge line was going to be difficult, but that wasn't the case with Anastasia. The filly's color was black and white, with her coat shedding to a different color. It was a bit of an ugly change, but that was to expect with foals as they get older. Anastasia was a fast learner. She learned a certain command by voice or sound. This impressed Emily, as she continued her training with Anastasia. One winter was Anastasia's first winter, and it was starting to get cold again, and the weather was changing. Anastasia, whenever she saw snow, she rearing and bucking with joy, as this was her first time seeing snow ever in her life. As much as Emily laughs and smiles at Anastasia, she was getting a bit big herself, just like yesterday that Anastasia was just a young filly that was born. A year had gone by, and Anastasia was only just a year old. She was a yearling now, and had become more independent as a mature horse. Emily couldn't believe how big her horse was gotten big, and she just wished Anastasia just stayed as a foal and never grew up. However, at this point it happens in life. All animals and humans get older, and they change as how they grow. Anastasia would be always happy to see Emily or her aunt and uncle, whenever it was feeding time or pasture time. Anastasia was always happy to see her owners looking after her. Emily still cared for Anastasia. While she was broken to lunging and ground manners, it was going to be time for her to get used to the saddle, bridle, and etc. on her. However, Emily wanted to take the training slowly, and started off with Anastasia wearing a bridle with no reins and a bit on. Anastasia disliked the bit on the bridle. It was a harsh one, but it was the training one Emily used on her. To Anastasia, it was like having a piece of metal in your mouth, and for as long as Emily would allow Anastasia to wear the bridle with the bit on. It was a bit, but it took months till Anastasia got used to the bit in her mouth, and that's when Anastasia was almost 2 years old. It was April when Emily started training with her with the girth and saddle along with the saddle pad on. To Anastasia, it was different, but it did take her a while to get used to having the saddle and girth on. The girth did feel tight, but Anastasia had to put up with it since Emily was training her. Anastasia had been by herself in a pasture ever since the colts were sold to other people for training, breeding, or whatever they had in store for them. Anastasia was doing very well and independent. Emily had put a lot of hard work and effort into training Anastasia, and with the tack she used on her, Western and English riding, it was a slow process throughout everything. But when Anastasia was 3 years old, Emily was 22 and she was going to turn 23 in a month. It was May when she was finally able to sit on the saddle. It was a sunny spring day, not too hot or too cold to ride. The day was just right. Emily groomed Anastasia before tacking her up, and she was in the English riding tack, to which Anastasia was used to, along with Western. "Let's see how well you can do," Emily whispered, as she led Anastasia into the outdoor arena. She got on Anastasia after tying up the girth and safety check on everything. Once she was on the mare's back, Emily started to do flat rides with Anastasia, as they start on English riding. The same could also be said for Western riding. Anastasia was a smart mare, and she knew the command by leg and voice commands. She didn't need the crop too much. This surprised Emily, as the other horses starting to train with a person on the saddle on their back. They do get testy and stubborn. However, Anastasia was different, and seemed to have picked up everything she had learned from her mother. Ever since she was a young filly, she had watched how Emily rode her mother's star, and so she gained a bit of knowledge that day. Anastasia was able to do walking with Emily on her back. After 10 minutes of walking, Emily finally got Anastasia to trot, to which the mare did so without any hesitation. After trotting, doing loops and circles for about 15 minutes, Emily had Anastasia pick up a canter, to which it was a very smooth canter. Emily knew that Anastasia was full of surprises, and yet she always amazes her with everything she completed without any stubbornness from the mare. After doing so many flat rides throughout May on English style of riding, June came as when Emily did some Western flat riding with Anastasia, so she needed to get a bit of work on the Western riding since she had used the English tack on for English riding for a while. It was taking the mare a while to get used to. Emily had to balance Western and English riding on Anastasia, so that way the mare knows English and Western riding tasks and stuff. Paul and Amy were very proud of their niece, who had been training Anastasia very well. She was going to one day become champion at a horse show off property. Emily had gone off to off-show properties before with her aunt and uncle, and she won at some of the shows on other horses. However, Anastasia could probably do the best she can, and that someday she'll be able to compete in shows with Emily at her side. Emily trained her hard with Anastasia throughout the Western and English riding, and Anastasia was a quick learner when it came to riding, knowing the commands to listen to. Emily hopes that someday she and Anastasia will win at big at shows, and is really hoping for the best future for Anastasia as her career as a riding horse for both English and Western riding.